lovely to have you all. And I'd like to welcome you to our panel today, this morning, Writers and Translation. This is a very important panel, as well as important question that we pose today, because it's at the heart of all debates about identity and and at the heart of the debates about modernity and traditionalism. Language is the main or one of the main determinants of identity. It's a cornerstone in identity politics as well. We see it every day until this day. So the debate started post-colonial, went through the migrant literature in the West, and until this day, we kind of struggle to situate it within a negative light or a positive light. We're all somehow writers in translation, whether if we translate or if we choose to write in English. So the panel today highlights topics of language identity and representation beyond marginalization. We have 3 exceptional speakers and 4 papers I want to venture and present a paper from my thesis, PhD thesis, long time ago. Each speaker will be speaking for 10 minutes. We'll have ample time afterwards for discussion. And I think this is the strength of this panel. It's a small panel. We chose to speak for 10 minutes only, so we would be able to converse with the audience, and maybe we would find a middle ground here between the opponents and the proponents, I guess, for using English. First of all, our first speaker is someone who is very close to my heart. Actually, the 3 speakers today are dear friends of mine. The first speaker is, and we're very proud and honored to have him, Professor Sabri Hafid, is a Professor Emeritus of Modern Arabic and Comparative Literature in SOAS, University of London. He was my PhD advisor. Since he completed his PhD at SOAS in 1979, he taught Arabic literature, drama, comparative literature, English literature, and critical theory in several universities in Europe and in America, as well as the Arab world, including the American University of Cairo, Qatar, and TII. He is a prolific critic and academic who published numerous books and articles in English and Arabic on narrative discourse, drama, world literature, and literary and critical theory. He also edited the various sections of Arabic and Middle Eastern literatures in the monumental London Anthology of World Literatures. He is the founder and editor of the online cultural monthly Al-Kalima. His most recent book mirrors titled Mirrors of the Arabi Revolution, a journey. Mirrors of the Arabi Revolution. I don't have the rest of the title here, but it was published in Cairo 2016. His paper is titled Language and Power, Writing in Another Language. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hafid.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I would like to start by saying, if we accept the assumption that has been highly popularized by Michel Foucault, that knowledge is power, then translation is actually, and since this power is processed through language, then translation is actually a way of appropriating this power or transforming it from one location to another. The process through which this transformation or this struggle over power has been very long process in the Arab world. It went through three very distinctive phases. The first phase that started from the 8th century and went all the way to the 10th century, that you all probably know about it, the whole process of translation that started with Abbasid al-Mansur and went on to the establishment of the Bayt al-Hikmah, probably the first institute of translation ever established in the world. With this acquisition of power from all over the sources that were available at that time, the Sassanid, the Greek, the Indian cultures into Arabic, Arabic managed actually to expand as a language, to expand as a culture, to spread across many different geographies. The second phase probably is the mirror image of the first one, and this is between the 12th to the 15th century when Europe started to translate most of the work that has been created in that peak of the Arab culture. This period is, of course, if you all know about the first period, the second one was not very well popularized, but I use a very good example here, which is a famous novel by Umberto Eco. I think many of you either read it or have seen the film, where it takes place in that particular period, where the whole interaction between the abbots in the name of the Rose novel were actually talking about and translating Arabic texts into Latin at that time, and they were mentioning all sorts of, as if we have an intellectual discussion here, we'll be name dropping of Foucault or Barthes or Edward Said or Bakhtin. There they were actually, all the name dropping through the conversation in the name of the Rose. They mention many of all those Arab intellectual and thinkers that actually formed the basis of the European Renaissance. Last stage, if we go back, if we go back, the last stage is the one that took place of the interaction between the Arab and the West, between Arabic culture, the Arabic language, and the European languages in the 19th and the 20th century. The interesting thing is that the first two stages that I talked about, more or less the flow was from one direction to another, almost in the absence of the source from which the flow comes in. This is what I term, according to René Girard in his theory, famous theory of the novel, in which he talks about internal mediation and external mediation. This was mostly an external mediation where the rival is absent, and you acquire the knowledge from that source in the absence of any struggle over power and according to your own agenda. While in the final stage, where the interaction between the Arab and the West took place in the 19th and the 20th century in particular, it was a very tense internal mediation, where actually the object of the design is present and playing a very important role. Any look at the modern Arabic literature throughout the 20th century, you will find that there are always an interest in and interaction with the West in the major literary texts. From the first phase in the 19th century was more or less in the form of travel literature from Atatawi to Ashidiat. But when we come to the 20th century, we find that this phenomena persisted. We had Taha Hussein, الأيام ويا توفيق الحكيم إن عودة الروح or صفور من الشرق ويا يحيى حقي تبديل المهاشم. This is the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and Suhail Idris in the 1950s, الحي اللاتيني, then through Tayyip Saleh in the 60s, the well-known novel The Season of Migration to the North, and the process went on until the end of the 20th century and continue with us in the 20th century as well. In these stages, there is, as we see very clearly, a difference or a change in between the two stages. The stage of internal mediation is completely different from that of external mediation that took place in the past, in the first two cycles. The second, the final cycle in which we are actually still dealing with it, is one that is marked by internal mediation, by cultural dialogue with the West, and of course, struggle over the power there, and also by political knowledge, the ideology, and I have more or less differentiated the two processes in front of you here. Mostly the ideological nature of the final stage is very evident from any analysis of these texts. Because of the time, I want to go move quickly to the more or less the general attitude and general more or less general image that comes from the writing on this interaction with the West. And this started with seeing the West as a model, then ended up with seeing it as adversarial. There is, after that, a very important milestone I consider in the change of the relationship between the two. And this is the main project of Orientalism that Edward Said started in 1978. It is a whole project. A lot of people just consider the main book of Orientalism itself, but it was Fat Said produced 5 different books, more or less to elaborate, to extend his argument and his thesis of the domination of the East by the West through the process of writing about it, explaining it, the two processes that he separated and overt Orientalism went on from Orientalism all the way to his 2 case studies, very clear case study, one on the question of Palestine, the second one on covering Islam, how the media covered Islam during the Iranian Revolution, the case of Ireland, nationalism and colonialism, and finally with the culture and imperialism. kind of a recognition of the literary value as well as a recognition of the importance of that culture to be translated and to use some examples from sociology of literature, sociology of culture. I remember in the 1990s, early 1990s, when Mahfouz's trilogy, Cairo trilogy, was translated into English for the first time, French first and then into English, that he actually told me that his copyrights from just one novel translated into English and French was much more than all the money he got from his 40 other books in Arabic. Uh, this is a very telling, not only about the power of the language, that the language carries with it recognition, it carries with it also material power as well as the political and other forms of power, which is symbolic powers that we know. And this made it very more or less problematic and very desirable at the same time to get your text translated into one of the two main European languages. A little bit later, particularly after the appearance of Said's work on Orientalism, we have another phenomena of Arab writers who happen to master another language, writing in that language. We have much earlier the Algerian and the Moroccan writing in French, but in English this was much more recent phenomena where actually we had writers like Hadaf Suwaif from Egypt or Gamal Mahjoub from the Sudan and many others from Palestine. We have them starting to appropriate the English language in order to represent themselves, because the whole question of representation has been problematized through Said's work, and to actually represent their realm, their culture in a completely different way without the mediation of a translation in the process. Although it is, in a way, another form of translating an experience outside of its language, outside of its cultural context, into a different language. I wanted to probably end this intervention by saying that we reached now a stage where we have writers who are actually born into the English language from a mixed background, like Omar Robert Hamilton and his recent novel that managed to get praised by Lucia, a Nobel laureate, who actually appreciated that novel that was written about the recent Egyptian revolution of 2011. At the meantime, we have with that, and probably, and I mentioned that very rarely addressed when we address writers who write in English, we always concentrate on those who write creative writing, who write novels or poetry or short stories. But we have another phenomenon now, a large number of Arab scholars writing on their culture in French or English. And this has become a growing process and has seen with it a transformation of the quote unquote Orientalist discourse on the Arab world or on the Arabic culture. Although in the past, the Arabic culture was seen, regularly seen, as part of the Arabic language and the Arabic literature, was seen as part of the classics, i.e., like Greek and Latin, like the languages of culture that once existed and probably died and no longer exist. With the advent of the Arab scholar working on modern literature in particular and working on our culture, things started to change. We started having Arabic scholars from many different countries writing in English on modern literature. But they more or less, like any rising minority literature, it started by adopting the mode of the philological approach in which many of the work of the old Orientalists was written, as in the case, it was a stage that exemplifies in the work of Mustafa Badawi in Oxford and so on. And with the following generation, including my generation, we tried to bring this writing out of the old philological approach to the main debate in the modern language. Arabic become part of the debate in modern language, debate about theory, debate about modern critical approaches, debate about all these new literary methods and interdisciplinary methods, and for that we got different styles of writing. And I have been through a long career that spanned nearly 25 years at SOAS, encouraging even my students, including my brilliant student here, to work with the most recent theoretical approaches. She used the post-colonial theory in the study of both Arabic and African literature. PhDs, there were others using the feminist theory, there was others using also post-colonial slash apartheid Palestinian issues, working with Nadine Goldsmar and Sahib Khalifa, and so on. So we started actually now to accumulate a new form of literature written in English by Arabic scholars writing about their own culture and presenting it rather than it was represented for them by the Arabs. Thank you.
Does this work? Yes? Thank you, Professor Fadli. We'll take questions by the end if you don't mind. Our second speaker is someone who I know on social media, but just met this time, and I'm very, very happy to have her here. Dr. CHSS-HBKU is an assistant professor of English literature at Gulf University of Science and Technology from Kuwait. Her research interests include women's studies, Arab women's writings, and disability studies. She has published widely in journals such as the Journal of Literary and Cultural Literary and Cultural Disability Studies, Journal of Middle Eastern Women's Studies, and Arab Journal for the Humanities. Her authored books include Literary Madness and British Post-Colonial and Bedouin Women's Writing, published in 2016, Notes on the Flesh, 2017, and Once Upon a Time, There Was a Life, 2018. Her recent work is a children's book, which I hope you got me a copy of. Yes, dealing with disability in the Arab world. Please join me in welcoming Dr.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for that nice introduction. This is my first time at the conference, and I've been very impressed and very welcomed. So thank you all. I'll begin by attempting to answer the question of Anglophone writers and the question we always get, why write in English when you can write in Arabic? So I'll try to contextualize my own work. I'm an Arab scholar and a creative writer. I teach literature, English and world literature, and I happen to write poetry and prose in English. My recent work is called Notes on the Flesh, and it is a hybrid work in itself. It is placed between fiction and non-fiction, truth and myth. Notes on the Flesh is, dare I say, the first collection of stories dealing with disability and love in the Gulf region. It is the labor of an academic who is also a creative writer who also lives with a disability. So far, I have placed myself in 3 distinct but not separate categories. Because of my own hybrid state of living, the narrative's chosen language is not the only issue. English chose me. I did not choose English. Let me just step back and read a few passages from the book. I was diagnosed with a disability at the age of 18. I'm a bit older now. And I've been living with it for a while, so that was what sparked the interest in the book. Okay. I was going to read from the passage on the book. Okay, so this is the image of the book. This is Notes on the Flesh, and it's being taught in some women's studies courses abroad, not yet in the Gulf region, which we can discuss later. So this is a collection of moments, of reflections, and the stories tend to flow in no order at all. This is done, of course, on purpose. These are moments when I am your unreliable narrator, and in a sense, my body has failed me, and this is but an attempt at reconstructing the experience of love, loss, meaning, and purpose. After the Gulf War in 1990, the Iraq invasion of Kuwait, from then on, I was no longer able to speak Palestinian, which was my mother's dialect, and I had to speak Kuwaiti instead, which was my father's dialect. Mama started speaking Kuwaiti to protect me from bullying that took place in the streets and at school. Even my father's family made fun of me. I started stuttering in public because speech was no longer safe. Every time I mixed my parents' dialects, I was told off by one of them. Slowly, language was used as a weapon. As such, because of my personal and academic background, I looked for a language that could accommodate and interpret the lived experience of pain. My understanding of women's writing is directly influenced by Hélène Cixous's essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, French feminist, and her concept of a feminine text. According to French feminists in the 90s, women were generally absent in literature. They still are. They were written about not as subject, but as object. Their experiences were decentered. Women's writing then called for a new critique on material and ideological forms of phallocentrism. It calls for the abolishing of anti-love that women and other minorities are brought up to believe. In my case, as a writer choosing to write in English, English for me was the language carried within my body. Allow me to refer to Atel Adnan's commentary on writing in a foreign language, Lebanese-American poet and artist. She says, poets are deeply rooted in language, and they transcend language. Someone can stand up and ask me, why didn't I, at some point in my life, learn Arabic? This is a question that haunts me. I don't go on accusing the old colonial system like Frantz Fanon so beautifully did. I am not, and Arab writers are not, in the situation of the Black African writers whose native languages have been totally eradicated by both the French colonial administration and then by their own governments. Arab writers are totally responsible for the language that they use. Like Atel Adnan, I cannot say I am in the position of a post-colonial writer. English was not the colonizer's language. Kuwait, my home, was a place where 2 cultures mixed, and my American education at school, where I spent more than 80% of my day, became the known language, the closest language to my body. At school, I avoided the repercussions of the Gulf War, the split that had happened between my parents' cultures and dialects. As an Arab woman writer, my sociocultural circumstances involved an adoptive culture and language. So unlike many immigrant Arab writers or Arab Anglophone writers like Ahdaf Suwaif, Fadia Faqir, Diana Abu Jaber, I cannot say I was forced into exile. In my case, exile came from within my own body. Culturally, I was brought up as a hybrid, and later my body refused to adhere to a strict category of normalcy. Instead, disability entered the picture. At a very young age, I struggled with an illness that left me paralyzed at times, struggling to speak, to articulate, to move, and my senses were lost. What was left then was language, and even language had failed to express the disconnect between my mind and my body. So much for Cartesian dualisms, the mind and body were not separate. I had to try and make sense of a failing body, and I felt exiled from within my own body, which is the closest home to my mind. The motherland for me was the body, the maternal space of being. The body's betrayal forced me to look inwards, and I searched for a poetic and chaotic language that I was well versed in. English was safer because English was borrowed, and I took it, adopted it, inked it into my body, and allowed it to speak for my body and other bodies that were silenced and shunned. Exiled. Exile for me was a state of illness, a vulnerability that we all faced one day. Feeling exiled and stigmatized for failing to adhere to society's expectations of health and ability, disability became an invisible place, one that demanded to be heard. As an academic working on disability studies in literature and women's narratives, I used English as a bridge between my lost home and a sense of security. I reverted to the language that was not attached to the law of the father, to society, to religious discourse. This is not to say that English does not carry its own Western phallocentrism and ideology, but for me as an Arab woman, it did not haunt me. I claimed it, transformed it, and allowed it to speak for my body. There's a lot of different critics that I wanted to talk about, but one critic says, Stephen Kellman, that there's a prejudice against affairs with other languages. And he says, translingualism, the act of writing in more than one language or in a language other than one's primary one, has been conceived of in terms of sexual betrayal. Henry James characterized L1 as the mother tongue and L2 as the wife, but others have regarded switching languages variously as disloyalty to the mother, adultery or polygamy. And that's his quote. Translingual writers must contend with readers' suspicions and conclusions, and they need to find a space in between and outside the borders and margins of languages and cultures. To take this argument further, I suggest that to exist outside of one's mind-body dualism is to complicate any sense of belonging. To belong in one's mother's tongue is also to belong in one's body. What happens then when the body expels the self? There is a personal loss because of war, hybridity, and disability. But this loss and exile must make room for more, an adopted language, or a second mother, or another language. The text notes on the flesh is a biomythography. Even the genre is in between fiction and non-fiction. Writing for me became a place to heal, a place where I constructed and reconstructed parts of myself and language. I do use some Arabic phrases in the text, and they're left not translated. There's no footnote either. Fiction in this case allowed me to remember, to uncover trauma, to open up a space where healing and memory went hand in hand. It is not easy to decide what constitutes an Arab woman's identity, and certainly not when the identities and lives of modern Arab women come into question. My work is not meant to be overtly political. It does consider issues of the self-body and its relation to the development and or disruption of a life narrative. What happens instead of recovering any sense of authentic self or language is a challenge. What my work suggests is that when a woman writes about herself, she is both writing and unwriting what has been previously written by patriarchal discourse. Writing then becomes an important process. It is not the destination or the conclusive and definitive self that we arrive at. Writing this collection of stories became a method of interpreting and critiquing the myth of ideal bodies and authentic selves. The lack of closure in the text, the lack of ending, upset many of my readers. Many questions were asked, including, why did you not write in Arabic? There is a seeming betrayal of Arabic, which diverts attention, I think, from the bigger issue at hand, women writing their bodies. Contemporary Arab women writers can and should surpass the feature of post-coloniality attributed to them by most literary critics. Writing in English may also provide some liberty in discussing some cultural and or religious issues. There is a sense of distancing. Yet at the same time, there is a bridge that is formed by the Arab woman writer who chooses to write in English. And this bridge is cross-cultural. The emotion at the heart of the narrative is culturally specific. It is Arab, it is a woman writing her body, it is multiple, and it defies any rigid dichotomies. Literary critics need to move beyond the question of why write in English when these diverse experiences of Arab women are being written into a particular discourse using a major language, English in this case, in order to set out a new literary canon. Stories are told in whichever way we tell them, whichever way they choose to be told. Bodies speak, and bodies bear witness to pain. And pain has no one or authentic language. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You remind me of myself 10 years ago. And our third speaker, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Ahmed Diab. He's an assistant professor of modern Arabic literature and cinema at the University of California, Berkeley. He received his BA from Damascus. He majored in English literature, and he completed his MA in English literature at the City University of New York while on a Fulbright scholarship. He was awarded a PhD from the Department of Middle Eastern Studies, New York University. His research interests are modern Arabic literature, translation literature, Arabic philosophy, right? Philology. This is me writing at 11 p.m. Middle Eastern cinema, post-colonial politics of culture and representation. He is currently working on his first academic book, provisionally titled Intimate Others, Representations of Arab and the Palestinian Imagery. Please welcome Dr. Ahmed Diab, who will be talking on jet lagged writing.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. I'm very glad to be in Doha, participate in this conference. It's my first time. I'm very impressed. And it's an honor also to share a panel with the previous generation of scholars from whom we've learned quite a bit and who've opened, who are pathfinders and trailblazers for a lot of us who work on Arabic literature. It's also an honor to make new connections, new friends. From the region, Arab scholars working on literature in the Arab world, unlike me, all the way in the Pacific exile. The title of my talk, which will, I believe my state will give justice to in terms of my potential incoherence, since I am jet lagged. Is on jet lagged writing, something it's a concept that I'm working with, I'm toying with, I'm developing, and I hope that whatever incoherence it might entail will be salvaged by some kind of logic that the argument would make clear. So I'm going to time my presentation. So I'm grateful for this opportunity, which allows me to step away from analysis in the academic sense and ruminate on my relationship with the English language as an Arab academic teaching and writing in the US. On certain flights, typically those departing from a cosmopolitan, multilingual center, distant for a provincial, monolingual, familiar periphery, the language of home flutters in the air of the terminal before you even board the plane, I used to think. As more passengers arrive at the gate, Arabic becomes louder, clearer, like the scent of a popular perfume. Duty-free section, you just left behind. The official airline announcements bifurcate, giving way to fleeting pairs of sentences in both English and Arabic. In those days, these were my early days in graduate school in New York, flying back on Jordanian Airlines to Amman, then on to Damascus. The familiarity of those days, the familiarity of mother tongue at the gate lulled me into a state of restored quiet after the terror of going through security screenings with its clear, curt English orders. Do this, go there, step forward. I've always found these abrupt changes in place and language to be fascinating and to be inextricably linked. Today, hundreds of thousands of air miles later, I've come to see my experience with English to be one of perpetual jet lag. In quite literal sense, it is the state I'm in the present time, having crossed 11 time zones to come here from my home in San Francisco in the Pacific. My body tells me quite rudely that it is 11 p.m. yesterday, while you would insist that it's clearly 9 a.m. today. This discrepancy between the body and its place in the world is something that I've come to accept as an impossibility that is also generative of many of the things that I do and write about in my professional capacity. It's to my mind also a preferred state of being to stasis and staying put and staying in place. Jet lag forces you through biological disorder to realize the intellectual assimilation of differences in time and space is a painful thing. It's not a given at all. It's the incoherence that is brought about this feeble cognitive ability that is the result of crossing time zones, attempting the unnatural, is in a lot of ways the experience of a writer and a speaker in a language that is not his or her mother tongue. I found myself when I'm jet lagged, I do away with the nuance of synonyms and gradation of meaning, and I settle for the most basic word that would convey the thought that I have. And it's that to me is one of the distinctions between the liberty of producing and writing in one's mother tongue and being reduced to something less than that in my case, English, which was a language that was my relationship with English was always fraught, and I would dare say unnatural, in the sense that my first word in English was not a real word. It was an acronym for an aid agency. First word I ever saw in English was UNRWA, and it was on these supple green notebooks that we used to receive from schools. And it was a notebook that we used to write homework in Arabic on. But right on the cover, there was the logo of the UN, and in English letters, UNRWA. I don't think that's, in that sense, my relationship with this language was like several others. As a child in Syria, as a Palestinian, child of two Palestinian refugees in Syria, was an unnatural beginning for this relationship. Later in teenage years, English was an escape from the monotony of life under dictatorship and the monotonality of official speak. In college, it was a way out of that educational system, in the sense that studying English literature, I think, is commonly, it's a common phenomenon, at least for people in my generation. I believe it's not limited to Syria. You study English literature in part because you want to connect with the rest of the world. You as an escape of the provincialism that plagues, at least the perception of provincialism that plagues the humanities in places at least like Syria in the 90s and early 2000, in my experience. You so the latest and then it's you when you are in a place where English is the common language, is the first language of your peers, then that process of self-questioning becomes I think this is part of the incoherence of jet lag that I'm trying to explain and illustrate. And when you switch to English as the norm, as the mother tongue of all those around you, then in that moment, the questions that you're faced with as someone who works on your mother culture, your Arabic culture, becomes these questions become all the more palpable and important beyond the academic goals that you set out to you set for yourself in a graduate school program. In graduate school, you discover you read Orientalism, you read also through Emily Apter and through scholars who work on French and English, you discover Arab critics and Arab writers such as Abdel Fattah Kilito. You read لن تتكلم لغتي, and you read him, critiquing this multicultural, multilingual claim to acceptance, and you start also questioning these claims to yes, the claims to superior multiculturalism that is capable of absorbing all these other cultures that are considered to be peripheral, inferior. The list is long. So today I must say I find myself getting closely or slowly sold on Kilito's argument, which he lists as an example. He says that when he speaks of this encounter with an American woman who speaks the Moroccan Darija so fluently, so compellingly, using this very sort of idiosyncratic expression, and his reaction to that encounter is utter defensiveness. How dare she speak my language so well, so beautifully, so compellingly? He feels disarmed. And listing other examples, for example, Ashidya, when in Tunis he is asked whether he speaks French, his answer, and I'm going to quote it here in the Arabic, سأله وزير الدولة هل تعرف اللغة الفرنساوية؟ قال لا يا سيدي ما عنيت بها فإني ما كنت أتعلم لسان الإنجليز حتى نسيت من لغتي قدر ما تعلمته منه فقد قدر على رأسي أن يسع قدرا معلوما من العلم فمتى زاد من جهة نقص من أخرى. i.e. there's a limited capacity, and you cannot possibly be proficient in another language without some kind of damage being done to your mother tongue, which is, in a certain sense, a conservative position to take. But to take it in the 21st century, I think is it's a more complex than just your traditional conservative monolingualism. Kirito seems to suggest that the claim to multilingualism, to multiculturalism, is a constructed claim, and it's a claim that is with its own agenda. It's not devoid of its perhaps pernicious even agendas. So I wanted to also forgive me for the incoherence of the jet lag. There's no melatonin for this. So on a good day, on a good day, I will quote. One of my favorite authors is Roberto Bolaño, the Chilean novelist. On a good day, I remember this quote from 2666. On a bad day, I'm gonna go back to this quote, but on a bad day, I reminisce about what if I had my grandfather's life? What if history did not create this rift in Palestine, in the Galilee? What if I had his provincial life in a village in the Galilee, and I never left, and my entire existence would revolve around a 10-kilometer radius between my relatives and my grove and my well. And I fetishize this sort of, I have this sort of fetish for the stagnant, the stationary, the confident of one's place. These are the bad days. The good days, I remember this quote from Bolaño's 2666, where Amalfitano reflects on jet lag as a phenomenon. So the quote goes, Amalfitano had some rather idiosyncratic ideas about jet lag. They weren't consistent, so it might be an exaggeration to call them ideas. They were feelings, make-believe ideas, as if he were looking out of the window and forcing himself to see an extraterrestrial landscape. He believed, or liked to think he believed, that when a person was in Barcelona, the people living and present in Buenos Aires or Mexico City didn't exist. The time difference only masked their non-existence. And so, if you suddenly traveled to cities that, according to this theory, did not exist or hadn't yet had the time to put themselves together, the result was the phenomenon known as jet lag, which arose not from your exhaustion, but from the exhaustion of the people who would still have been asleep if you hadn't traveled. This was something he'd probably read in some science fiction novel or story, and that he'd forgotten having read. So this quote puts the onus on those who stay put, rather than those who travel. Jet lag is the exhaustion of those who stay put, trying to put some sort of an existence together and to present it to the traveler, to be in sync with the traveler. And to me, this is a much centering the traveler versus the stagnant, the stationary, is a taxing as it is, exhausting as it is. The double vision that it entails in it is preferable to the alternative, having never left, having stayed put, having been monolingual, confident, sure of every single word I utter, speaking one dialect. The jet lag, grogginess, incoherence would still be preferable to this state of staying put. Thank you.
promised to deliver, so I'll present for 5 minutes because I want to talk more about what my colleagues have presented. My paper is very straightforward. It's not as informative as Professor Sabri's or poetic and creative as my colleagues. I want to touch on language, the language dilemma of using English as a medium in post-colonial literature. And this is why I think maybe this gives a better frame for my part of the discussion. Let me begin by saying language as culture is the collective memory bank of people's experience in history. Language is more than a means, let me start, 5 minutes. Language is more than a means of communication. It's through which one is able to perceive oneself and one's place in the world. The British Empire imposed the language, the English language on its colonies, and through its educational system, and I quote here, they installed a standard version of the metropolitan language as the norm, and marginalized all variants as impurities, unquote. English became the official language in Britain's African colonies and the language of government, commerce, and education. English during post-independence times became the language of the intelligentsia, the language of modernity and technology, and posed itself as a prerequisite of global citizenship. Still, and contrary to the English that was perceived as the language of cultural imperialism that lingered when the political dominance ended. Thus, issues of national identity and representation became paramount in the debate on English as a lingua franca and the native languages that have been affected considerably. Different forms of cultural representations, the novel being one of them, in a post-colonial era have adopted English and chose it over native languages for multiple reasons. One, utilizing the same weapon that guarantees wider audience. Two, using English to promote native cultures that wouldn't be either recorded or read by international audience. Three, English became in many contexts the neutral language that brings natives with different languages together and is the only one that doesn't carry ethnic markers or religious connotations or cultural overtones. The language of post-colonial literature has presented a conundrum, an issue that was largely debated and fell in between two views. The opponents who rejected using English and called for decolonizing language and culture, arguing that self-determining requires a unified vision of post-colonial identity which calls for indigenous languages and the use of indigenous languages, rejecting the colonial destructive imposition of language and culture. While proponents who advocated for adopting English and domesticating it and making it theirs, and language hybridity emerged as a response by bilinguals and hybrid intellectuals. The opponents, again, looked at it as a linguistic displacement, which raised issues of representation and belonging. English should not be adopted in culture that strives to shake off the impact of colonialism, as it leads to cultural and social alienation by groups adopting it. Proponents, on the other hand, follows Bremer's description of losing it from its colonial past, and this happens when he explains, I quote, writers must subject English to processes of syntactic and verbal dislocation by adapting local idioms and cultural reference, and English is acclimatized and made national. End of quote. Proponents encourages writers to mold the language to fit their needs and to expand the frontiers of English by incorporating local lexicons, themes, and styles. The language dilemma was reflected both in form and content in post-colonial literature, and its offspring, migrant literature, and African writers engaged in that debate. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, a Kenyan writer, presents both sides of the coin. As a bilingual, he embraced English as a medium for his writings. In fact, the first novel to be published in English by an East African author was by him, Weep Not Child, in 1964. Later, he embraces the call for decolonization and abandons English in favor of his native language. Raju Rao, one of the most significant Indian writers writing in English, in his foreword for Kantapura in 1963, describes the problematic situation of being bilingual when he defines English as, and I quote, the language of our intellectual makeup, but not of our emotional makeup, unquote. He explains further that, quote, we cannot write like the English. We should not. We cannot write only, and we cannot write only as Indians. We have grown to look at the large world as part of us. Our method of expression, therefore, has to be a dialect which will someday be as distinctive and colorful as the Irish or the American. Time alone will justify, unquote. What's language hybridity then? Linguistic hybridity functions as a new paradigm in looking at the localization of English into different forms of Englishes. It elaborates the language of its previous mode of imperial connotation and reflects the multicultural, multilinguistic realities of post-independence nations. Language hybridity assumes the position of resistance language, one that challenges the power of English by using it. Hybridity goes beyond duality and dichotomies to reflect a state of amalgam, mixture, and fusion. I'll stop here. Thank you so much. I'd like to open now the floor for questions. I do have many questions and I can help you if you don't. But let's see. Do we have questions?
Hello. Thank you for all the presenters. My question goes out to Dr. Shahad and Dr. Ahmad, specifically because you cited an interesting take on language vis-a-vis war and conflict. And I could relate, growing up in Beirut during the 80s. So, do you see parallels between your work at certain levels and differences? And if yes, what are they? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I haven't heard Ahmed's talk until just now, but while he was speaking, I realized, especially when you were saying about jet lag being, this state of continuously moving, I realized that that was my answer for the state of constant anxiety I was in about writing in English and not in Arabic. It was a better place to be, to move into the world, to travel into the world, and especially in my case, it was to travel almost outside of the body and into the world. English was adopted as a result of, I think, the Gulf War. I was initially in an Arabic school, but because of the culture at the time, there was a lot of issues with language and Kuwaitis versus Palestinians. It was a choice, as Dr. Anna said, a neutral space. And I hope that answers it.
English for me was never a neutral place. It was in Syria. It was a way out of the static life under dictatorship. And then in New York and now in California, Berkeley, it's also not a neutral language, and it's not a neutral place. And it's not, one thing I've also observed is that even people like Saeed, for example, Arabic is the domain of the domestic, and English is the domain of the educational and the professional. And I find that to be, also problematic partition. For me, as I teach Arabic literature in the U.S., so Arabic has become my home in a way. So it's not, and it is a professional relationship that I have with Arabic. It's not only the domestic phone calls with the family or the former past life in growing up in Syria. So I have problems with ascribing certain professional and psychological dimensions to certain languages. because it does have its colonial overtones, where when you suggest that certain languages are better suited for certain aspects of one's life than others.
May I follow up on this? So that you ended up your talk saying that I'd rather be in that jet lag space rather than, well, do you really believe in that? Do you really believe that you're in a jet lag space? If we are, this poses a huge problem. We're referring to ourselves as human beings, while we're academics, instead of looking at ourselves as hybrids who can actually bridge the divides between these things.
I think we're able to bridge the divide by being incoherent beings. I think our incoherence can suggest to both parties that that bridge is not as easy as they make it sound to be, as they make it appear to be. I don't, and there's my experience in grad school in the U.S. I've come into contact with a lot of people who claim to work on Arabic literature, and it turns out they work on translated Arabic literature. Their Arabic competency is really not up to the task. And the way they get around this is coherence. If you present a coherent argument as a book, relying on translated literature, that's enough for the academic system in the US, for the academic publishing system in the US. So I think in the incoherence, there's a truer engagement with the untranslatable, with the irreconcilable, which today is not it's not a taboo anymore. There are entire books that list the untranslatable words, even between Romance languages or languages that have close affinity to one another. So I don't think it has to be at the expense of bridging the gap. Jet lag is real, but it allows people to be in a different time zone, in a different physical space.
Yes, please. Then we have one here.
Thank you very much, impressive panel. On this issue of incoherences and bridging the gap, because this is what translation studies is about, actually, or translators are supposed to do. There is a very interesting example which I really like drawing on from a webcomic that was created by an Egyptian young adult, Dina Mohamed, in Egypt. She was experiencing the Egyptian revolution when she was 17, and she decided to do a webcomic in English, even though her first language was Arabic, of course. And she justifies it in terms of, it's the language of the blogosphere, and when you're an activist and you work with a wide audience and an international audience, you need to use English. So this is how she justified it. But I found that the way in which she did this webcomic, whose main character was Kahira, playing on the name of the city, she was a woman, and the whole point of the webcomic was to show the involvement of women in the Egyptian revolution and the activism of women, and also the issues of harassment in the streets and these kind of issues. And she created the character as a form of a translation of her own narratives. And the character is like a superhero, which is not really a kind of theme that works really well in Arabic. And she chose to cover the character with the bahia. So she really wears a black bahia. And she justifies it as a way of framing feminism beyond this Western feminine type of feminism, which tends to be Islamophobic. And the way, she was really clear that if her audience had been Arabic or local, she would have probably not used the barrier. So it was really a way of escaping from this kind of stereotypes. And it's full of incoherences when you read her narratives and how she positions herself as a young woman in Egypt and in the Egyptian revolution and in the globosphere. You see that actually she has very shifting positioning according to the audience she's addressing. So the audience also shape the way we translate ourselves. So I found that an interesting example of incoherences and the way we try to bridge the gap and we avoid specific bridges, which are very pernicious. Thank you.
Yeah. Just to clarify, I think here, Spivak's landmark article, Can This Subaltern Speak? To my mind, that article or another article needs to be written with maybe a title, Can the Non-European Think? And what I mean by this is, can the non-European think in ways? Can the non-European think like us Europeans? So when we speak of coherence, it's not a sort of a universal concept that we're referring to. We're talking specifically about certain set of expectations that we that are grounded in epistemological historical realities that we are calling coherence. So I'm not. I don't want to be misunderstood as a champion of being incoherent on purpose, but I do think that when we speak of coherence, it's not a sort of a divine sort of self-revelatory concept. It's grounded in certain practices that are grounded in continental philosophy and certain modes of thinking and debating and writing. That's the kind of coherence that I'm referring to.
Post-colonialism, there was always references of the incoherence of the mind rather than the physical incoherence, and that always was used against the writer, who might think, although I don't think that is true, think in his native language but produces, his production comes out in English or the other way. But Chenyu Ashimi says, I read in English, and I don't think that my brain has a language. I think it's beyond language.
Yes. Here. Sorry. First, thank you all for your talks, and my question is to Dr. Shadi. You said that you mentioned some Arabic phrases in your book, but you decided not to translate them and not to put a footnote as well. May I know the reason behind this decision, please?
What do you think the reason is? I always throw the question back.
You have already decided to choose English, so why would you put the phrase in Arabic? Are you trying to get the audience to search these phrases up? Or?
Yeah, there you go. You answered the question. It's pretty much that. This is the teacher in me. I have to make you answer the question. Actually, yeah, because the words are in Kuwaiti dialect too, not specifically just the Fusha, and it does have that element of alienating the reader. And you go and just use Google, search. And also, again, because, like I said, the heart of the narrative is very Arab, it's very Kuwaiti, it's even more specific than that. So I hope that answers it. Thank you for the question.
Hello, my question is to Dr. Shahad. Thank you so much for your talk. It was very interesting and it presented an issue that I think a lot of people actually relate to, especially in the Gulf region, and something that I personally relate to, being an Egyptian who's born and raised in Qatar and lived in Qatar all my life, and went to Qatari schools. So you would speak Egyptian at home and then would go to school, and then you have to also talk like the other kids talk. And my question is, do you think that resorting to English as a neutral space, as a safe space, kind of like a lost opportunity to present this identity issue and have it out there? And the second question is, do you actually talk about this issue in any of your work? Thank you.
So your question is an identity issue.
The identity, yeah.
Okay. Originally, I was really kind of in your position as a student and somebody who wanted to make sense of this nonsense of having so many languages, and with the disability coming into the mix, nothing really made sense to me. So identity was a big complex issue for me. It still kind of is. So I work on it academically, but also through the creative writing. What I found was also what Dr. Ellen mentioned a while back, the state of being a hybrid, which I thought was so negative and so incoherent, to quote Ahmed, and complete breakdown of the solid sense of self. I realized that there's more than one way of being in my mind and in my body too. Because you see me today, I look fine, but there are days when I have to use a cane, and then all of a sudden I'm in a state of disability where I was previously in a state of ability. So this randomness of being and identity, I had to make peace with it. Simply, I had to look at it as this is just a state of being. So I might have confused you a bit more, which is good.
Can I confuse you further? Just within this. I've just said that, I said this earlier, that Shadi asked me with myself 10 years ago. So the internal enforced psychological exile of being in a society where you, by name and by tribe, fit perfectly, but by dialect and by representation, and could be physically, you don't. And I'm a hybrid as well, my mom is not Qatari. The many social discriminations, now we call it discrimination. Back then it was looked at differently, to say the truth. Was because of the dialect, was because of the way you lived. Maybe the way you lived, you had more exposure than others. Your parents chose a life that was different than others, and you by default, was a part of that social construction. Then you made a choice. Your choice was not to sound like everyone else, because you can't. You can't force it. You can't fake it. You have a dialect that is but you know what? It's nice. Now I got yeah, now I accept it as different, and there is nothing wrong with being different. People will accept it too. The moment I accept. One last question? Yes. Then many hands now. Hello? Where is she?
Me here.
Yes.
So I'm going back to the conversation about the use of the second language as kind of an escape from the sometimes the taboos that are unspoken of in the community. We all know that each language comes with a baggage, so especially if you're growing up with that language. So maybe using a second language would help us express our vulnerability more, discuss issues that we're not used to talking about in our native language. I know personally I relate to that. I cannot be vulnerable in my own language. Whenever I want to be vulnerable or I want to talk very openly, I notice that I subconsciously shift to English when I'm talking. But I have to also think about, like, we have to also change the norms in the community and start a conversation about these things. And if we keep having those conversations in a language that the community that kind of gives home to these issues are not involved in, we are not actively contributing to changing these issues that we're dealing with, or engaging the people who are actual stakeholders or enabling factors in these issues. So as much as I feel more comfortable talking in English about a lot of the issues that we're suffering from in our local communities, I do believe that maybe starting a conversation in Arabic, maybe it's too immature at the moment to start that, but maybe in the future, when we start having those conversations in Arabic, we're engaging the people who might have the abilities or the power or the policies to actually change these things, and maybe it's a way to not exclude them from a conversation that needs to be started to change the realities instead of just discussing it and talking about it. What do you think?
I agree. Well, I think that, especially since I think you're picking up on the fact that sometimes English can be a tool to discuss, taboo issues and so on, but it doesn't necessarily alienate all readers. In my case, I know most of my readers are bilingual and they read the text in English. Now, the book is up for translation into Arabic, which, like you said, is probably, it's a bit premature, but I think society can handle it at this point.
And Shane, you're talking, this goes back to the role you're assuming. If you're a creative writer, yes, definitely. We all choose our audiences somehow. And depending on the audience, you have to really appropriate your message. So if you want to affect change in a society that is not highly bilingual, then you have to speak your language. Yeah, and after all, it is your language. Creating those dialogues in Arabic are paramount. I'm with you 100%. Half of what I want to do in this society, I cannot do because I don't have the language to do it. I agree. Oh, so, one more. Yes.
Wahib from Bin Zayed Center. My question to the first speaker, inshallah. As he said, once upon a time, the Arabs and Muslims scholars were the bridge of civilization, using Arabic language as translation, for the other world. Now, what is now our status regarding the Arabic language to, render to the existing world what is lacking behind? Is it democracy or justice, or is the language lacking behind? What? This is my question. Thank you.
I don't think that it is the language lacking behind. There is a very clear attempt going on to so many levels. There is, of course, the level of translation as a way of appropriating knowledge, as a way of being aware, and this process of translation expands the Arabic language and expands the ability of the Arabic language to deal with all of these issues. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not very successfully. At the same time, as I mentioned, there are two parallel processes, one of which is we have now a large number of Arab writers writing also in English, appropriating the language for their own purposes and for their own vision, and for positing their identities, their issues, their concerns on a much wider global stage because of the nature of the spread of the language of English, and how many readers for any word published in English compared with its equivalent in Arabic. This is one of the main problems that we have in the Arab world, that the most successful book probably sells a few thousand, while successful, equally successful book in English or French sells hundreds of thousands, if not millions sometimes. And that is why I mentioned this example of Mahfouz. One of the most interesting things, it is a process, and this process has been developing. And for instance, I didn't have time to go through all of these details. If you compare two generations of writers writing in English from an Arab descent, Hadaf, for instance, and her son now, Omar Robert Hamilton. Hadaf always Robert Hamilton. Hadaf always within the text needed to explain what Arabic terminology she uses and what Arabic quotes she uses, and there's a hilarious and wonderful section in one of her early novels, In the Eye of the Sun, in which she's trying to translate Sheikh Imam's song شرفتي نفس بابا بتاع الووترجيت عملوا لك قيمة وسيمة سلطيني فول بالزيت. She has the whole section explaining that. While her son now, who adopted Arabic culture much later, he doesn't explain a single word of Arabic that he writes in his novel, and he keeps it to enter the language to expand the English language in one way, and also to enter it as a concept, as a meaning, as a cluster of vision and so on. So the process is going on so many levels, and of course we have now a whole panel of Arab academics writing in English for academic purposes and for academic work, and this builds the mind of generation after generation to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have to end this. I want to end it with the following from Mahmoud Darwish poem that he has written for Edward Said. يقول أنا من هناك أنا من هنا ولست هناك ولست هنا لي اسمان يلتقيان ويفترقان ولي لغتان نسيت بأيهما كنت أحلم لي لغة إنجليزية للكتابة طيعت المفردات ولي لغة من حوار السماء أنا المتعدد في داخلي خارج المتجدد. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
وبعد وصلك حبيبك وصل حبيبك